Hello, good evening, and welcome to a fairly precarious live stream, actually. I was just saying to my co-hosts for this evening, Andy Brockman and Bethany Milburn, good evening to you two.
Good evening, Mark, and good evening, everybody.
Good evening. Hi.
Good evening. But I was just saying that so far I've really only streamed on this YouTube channel for gaming purposes, for Archeo gaming, as it were. But this evening we wanted to put together a stream discussing the toppling of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol, uh, and attempting to put it into a context, because it's interesting how statues are a little bit like language. I was reflecting about this on the Archaeosuit Facebook page yesterday. They are powerful, but also their their meaning can sometimes get lost through usage, and occasionally when people topple a statue, it's seen as as a truly horrendous act, as a vicious act, whereas actually, just like a word, it can fall out of usage if people decide that it's no longer relevant. And indeed, in the case of statues and other symbols, there's a strong and proud history of iconoclasm around the world, and hopefully we'll be touching on that as well during the course of this stream. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, Andy or Bethany, at this point?
I think all I would say is that we're very conscious as well that as we're broadcasting this now and recording it for later,
Mm,
um, we're actually in the middle of what the media will call a developing news story, because as we speak, there's a demonstration going on outside Oriel College in Oxford as part
yes.
of the Roads Must Fall campaign,
Hmm.
and also again as at the time of recording, the funeral of George Floyd is going on in Texas.
Yes.
The Black American who was killed by the police in circumstances that are horrifically public, and really is the reason we're all here now, because it's caused a shockwave around the world that's still reverberating.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and that shockwave led to the public action. Approximately 10,000 people turned up on Sunday to protest, to demonstrate in the name of Black Lives Matter, and it eventually led to the toppling of a fairly infamous statue in Bristol. And I suppose at this point, I'd like, just like, if possible, Andy, can you take us uh, through the I suppose a little bit of the context and the history and what happened on Sunday?
Right, and I think it's important to establish right from the get-go that what happened on Sunday wasn't something that happened spontaneously just on Sunday afternoon.
No.
In Bristol, this is something that's been building up for decades.
Hmm.
And perhaps we can come back to the more detailed context of the controversy over the Colston statue and the name of Colston in Bristol, perhaps later on in the cast. But essentially, 1 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, uh, people started gathering at College Green, which is a very famous meeting place between Bristol Cathedral and Bristol City Hall. People that know Bristol will know College Green very, very well, and may well even have attended rallies and demos there. As I was at uni in Bristol, and I certainly did.
Mm.
Um, Round about 2 o'clock, there was an 8 minute silence in memory of George Floyd, and that obviously the 8 minutes that it took for the policeman to basically choke George Floyd to death.
Mm.
Um, and the there were bells tolling. Um, People on the spot told Bristol Live, the Bristol local news website, that it was eerie. It made you realise that we'd been standing there in a long silence and we still had longer to go. It brought home how much time it was. I mean, people were really obviously engaged in the moment.
Yeah.
It was a very serious event. About 2:30, um, the rally left the green and began a march through the city. Um, and it's at this point that the Colston statue becomes the focus of the story, because around about 2:30, a group of people who had described again in the local news source as 3 men and a woman, secured a couple of nooses around the head of the statue. There were already ropes tied around the feet of the statue, and people started pulling at the statue.
Yes.
And this was being videoed. It was, I'm not sure if it was live streamed, but certainly video of this was popping up on the internet very, very quickly thereafter. The statue of Edward Colston, who we'll talk about later, was pulled to the ground. The ropes were left attached to it. People then very symbolically knelt on its neck. And then the statue was dragged through the streets to Bristol docks. And at this point, again, very controversially to some, the police took the decision to stand back and let events take their course. Again, we can maybe discuss that later on. Round about 3:45, 3:50, they've reached the docks at a place called the floating harbour, and basically, and the images we've all seen now of the statue being toppled into the water were recorded. So we're talking about the events really of a couple of hours on Sunday, but I think, you know, as we'll discuss, it's probably rewritten the way many of us actually look at the way we commemorate certain people and certain events in our streets, and perhaps we've been taught more about our history in the last couple of days than maybe many of us realised we were missing.
Well, certainly in my case, I hadn't heard of Edward Colston until this weekend. I have been to Bristol once. I had a very lovely ale while I was there called Proper Job. But I hadn't actually come across him or his statue before. But it's worthwhile saying that I have since learned that he was responsible for the transportation of at least 100,000 human beings, many thousands of which were children, from Africa to the US. Each of those human beings was stamped with the company logo. They were essentially they were property. They were, and the
well, actually, it's worth saying, actually, not stamped so much as actually branded on the chest.
Sorry, branded on the chest, and it's thought at least around 20,000 never made the journey. 20,000 died at least on journeys across the Atlantic and were thrown into the water. And this is one of the reasons why the statue ended up in the water in Bristol. It was seen as a fitting symbolic act of mirroring the fate of so many people who he had been directly responsible for the suffering of. And actually, it's interesting because on the statue plaque, my understanding is that he's described as being a wise, one of Bristol's wisest and essentially most virtuous sons. And people had been campaigning for a long time to add, not to take away the statue, but actually to add information with regards to what he did with regards to the slave trade, and also just to be essentially to add, in that sense, context to his wisdom. They wanted to make it clear precisely. So, for example, naming the numbers of children in particular. And there've been lots of back and forth in the conversation on that. So the council hadn't moved much until they said, well, we'll include the total number, but let's not talk about the children. So even then, there was a reluctance to be open and honest about this. Now, just before we dive into it, Andy, just before we dive into it, can we just hear from Bethany?
Yeah.
What were your impression of what happened on Sunday, Bethany?
Well, I mean, the same as you, Mark. I hadn't really heard of Colston before, and I've never been to Bristol. The first time I'd ever heard of Colston was last year at university in an early modern history module where we had a lecture about the British slave trade and the influence on harbour towns.
Yeah.
So Colston was touched upon, but I didn't really know much about him at all. And something that you mentioned, Andy, is that we've talked a lot more about our history following this event, and I've noticed a lot on Twitter, academics on Twitter who've been part of the discussion have all said it's really interesting how many more people suddenly know about Colston and what he did and his influence over Bristol after this event, but no one, well, very few people seem to talk about it before. And it's just, it's interesting how this event that you say took place in a matter of, a couple of hours, suddenly the whole country knows who Colston is and is discussing it. And it's just, it's just really interesting how very quickly an event like that can educate thousands of people.
Well, it's interesting, and I'll pass back to Andy in a second. I will, but it's interesting. I saw someone on Twitter actually expanding on that thought with a very brief sentence. They basically said that a friend of theirs had said that statues are rubbish, shall we say, at teaching history. and in that sense, they are so passive, and they have the ability to, people can just look at them and presume that honour is being bestowed without any context. That there's something to that. Anyway, Andy, go ahead.
Well, just pick up that point very briefly before the substantive point I was going to pick up. I think you're absolutely right to statues. I think people misunderstand about statues. Statues aren't there by and large to teach us about history. They're there to provide a focus for acclamation, really. I think statue. To commission a statue, it's always been quite an effort. You have to commission it. You have to design it. It has to be, fun, you have to go through the fundraising. It has to be made. It has to fulfil a societal purpose, and that isn't always necessarily to do with education. And I think it's probably worth here adding, for people that haven't been to Bristol and don't know Bristol, a little bit of the context of what Bristol actually is. Bristol is a port town in the west of England. It grew up in the Middle Ages as a fishing port and a trading port with the Mediterranean and Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. But because of its position facing the Atlantic, it became an important port once the colonies began to develop in North America.
Yeah. And
the other famous navigator from Bristol, who people might remember, is John Cabot, who wasn't actually Bristolian. He was Italian, but he sailed from Bristol, and in fact, a replica of his ship, the Matthew, is actually moored up in Bristol Harbour to this day. It's based there. In the 18th century, 17th and 18th century, it became important as one of the ports, Liverpool being another, Glasgow being another, of the ports that were part of what became known as the triangular trade, or perhaps more properly, the slave trade triangle. So you had the first passage where you took goods, and particularly trade goods, to the west coast of Africa. You traded those goods then for people. The middle passage was taking those people across the Atlantic to British possessions in the Indies or to South America, other European colonies, as were in the Americas at the time. And then the third leg of the passage, the third leg of the triangle, was the return trip to Western Europe, carrying things like sugar, rum, molasses, the products of the West Indian Caribbean plantations that were grown with the labour of enslaved people. So that Bristol was integral to that trade, and Colston is just one of many slave traders and slave captains who made a lot of money during that period in Bristol, and made Bristol the major city of the west of England that it remains. Subsequently, in the 19th century, with the coming of the railways, the Great Western Railway linking London to Bristol, then linked across from Bristol to North America. So again, it was one of the industrial powerhouses in the 19th century, until the harbour proved too small and too landlocked to actually survive the growth in maritime trade and the size, and particularly the size of ships.
Right.
So, but the other very famous figure who is attached to Bristol is Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the engineer and designer. And the final controversial attachment that Bristol has is to big tobacco, because one of the other big benefactors in Bristol, including to the university, were the Wills family of the Wills Tobacco Company. So in terms of industrial heritage, but also dark heritage, Bristol has quite a lot of questions to ask, and has been asking those questions of itself really certainly since they were being asked when I first knew the city in the early 1980s.
Right. Well, what has been the response then to this? I mean, I've seen a smattering of responses over the course of the past couple of days. Today, I must admit, I've been very busy editing, so I haven't really been on the news much. But I've heard some fairly extreme responses, in fact, to this. I mean, I guess Andy or Bethany, what struck you about the responses to this particular?
I think Bethany should go first on this, because one of the things that struck me about it is that although a lot of established historians and archaeologists and politicians have been putting it in there, suddenly hate me with. This, looking at the crowd there and looking at the crowds generally, actually, who are responding to the Black Lives Matter campaign and so on, it's a young movement. In the most visible parts of it are younger people, and I think perhaps Sir Bethany maybe should kick off on that one.
I still count as a young person, by the way.
And I still think of myself as a young person. And I'm certainly not suggesting Bethany tries to talk for an entire generation, but I just think I have to say...
Indeed, explain yourselves. Yeah.
No pressure. Mm-hmm. Well, the main thing that I've noticed, and I mean, Mark, you'll probably vouch for the fact that I've been very vocal about the whole situation on my social media, especially on my Facebook. Mm-hmm. And like you say, a lot of younger people have been sharing their viewpoints and information via social media if they can't go out and attend protests. Main thing I've noticed is it's a very divided view of what's happened. Some people are in favour of the statue being pulled down. Like you say, there are academics and archaeologists and politicians who do support it. And then there are people who think it's unequivocally wrong and it shouldn't have happened, and that it's an attempt to erase history. And that's where the big debate between parties has come in.
Yeah.
Obviously, the main reason that the statue has been pulled down is that it's viewed by, I don't want to say a majority, I'm not sure on numbers, but it is largely viewed as some sort of symbol of racism and a time that really is no longer should be tolerated in a modern society, and that's why people don't want the statue to be there. We touched on the fact that people have it's been viewed controversially for a long time. I think there's nearly 4 decades of people, mainly in Bristol, who've spoken to their councils and local politicians, and there's been campaigns and protests and petitions before saying, can you take it down? Can you move it? Mm-hmm. And the viewpoint was that there's been plenty of opportunity for the statue to be removed safely and placed in a museum or whatever they wanted to do with it, and it never happened. So the kind of last resort was that people felt that their view wasn't being listened to, so the statue was pulled down.
Well, and in that sense, I suppose that this weekend very much lit that blue touch paper, didn't it? On Twitter, for example, Professor Kate Williams laid out something quite very much along the lines that you were discussing. She said the people who say authorities should take down statues after discussion are correct, but this isn't happening. Bristol's been debating Edward Colston for years and wasn't getting anywhere. In 2018, it was agreed that the statue would bear a plaque noting his involvement in the slave trade, but then it proved impossible to find wording that everyone accepted. The first plaque that it bore, added when it was erected in 1895, said that it was erected by the citizens of Bristol as a memorial to one of the most virtuous and wise sons of their city, with no mention of slavery. Later in 2018, Bristol Council unveiled the wording for the second plaque. As a high official of the Royal African Company from 1680 to 1692, Edward Colston played an active role in the enslavement of over 84,000 Africans, including 12,000 children, of whom 19,000 died en route to the Caribbean and America. but the wording was continued to be contested, and it's been discussed by various groups that she goes on to point out. I think that probably the most alarming reaction that I've seen, though, and I shouldn't be surprised by this, but has come from people on the right, or indeed the further right. I won't say far right, because I don't want to give him that sort of kudos. But people, for example, using words like Taliban, saying that the Taliban was born today in Britain.
Let's not beat about the bush. This has played directly to the wish of certain people on the alt-right. And we're seeing this on both sides of the Atlantic, because we're seeing exactly the same things being said about people in the United States who want to bring down and remove to museums, or to remove from public spaces, statues of Confederate generals in particular from the American Civil War. The elephant in this particular room is Nigel Farage, the politician and broadcaster, who has been vociferous for the last few days, both on Twitter and on his LBC show, and in interviews with various parts of the media in Britain and in the United States, where, just to encapsulate this particular view, Farage tweeted on Sunday, a new form of Taliban was born in the UK today. Unless we get moral leadership quickly, our cities won't be worth living in. And then he added, if Boris Johnson won't lead and stand up for the country as its symbols are trashed, then people will start taking it into their own hands. Full-on race riots are now possible. Show leadership and fast. Now, the words petrol can, flames and fire spring to mind there. I mean, you can take whatever view you like of Mr. Farage and his particular brand of politics, but it's clearly that those words clearly aren't designed to seek a reconciliation and consensus.
It's not cooling the waters, is it? Incidentally, we've had a couple of interesting comments on this stream so far. Rosemary Morgan points out that Atin Shea Films had a very good video about this. And yes, he's talking about the US statues and monuments of Confederate history, but it's relevant to this conversation. And someone called Talasin has said that this is obviously a cultural Marxist channel. I suppose I would just point out that there's no such thing as cultural Marxism, and I'm not going to go any further with that, but there really isn't any such thing.
Well, I think I was going to say about the closest we've got to this is your actual given name, isn't it?
Well, indeed, yes. It's mine channel, which is I'm called Mark, and I'm somewhat cultured. Exactly, it's Mark's channel. The thing is, there's also more in the way of complications here, so much as the law was broken. There's conversations that were going on surrounding this statue were happening, and as was pointed out by the Prime Minister, I think yesterday, we live in a country of law and order, and there are ways of dealing with this. You can stand for election or vote for people who will represent the views that you would like to see in public life enacted. But it's a curious thing also, because we've also seen, for example, the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister describe this as an act of thuggery. And there's something I'd just very briefly like to bring into this, is something that I did mention yesterday on social media, is the fact that even that word actually reveals just how detached we are from the implications of lots of these symbols that we're surrounded by. Thuggery comes from the word thugi. It's a reference to bandits in India supposedly attacking and ritually murdering, in particular Brits on their travels. And they became notorious. They're even mentioned in the Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom movie. The thugi cult is the one that's pulling the hearts out of people. For our leaders, and in particular for one of our leaders, Priti Patel, whose parents, I believe, migrated from India, to use that word shows just how utterly detached we are from the meanings of these words and symbols, and how actually we have inherited the language of empire. And often this is unscrutinized in public life. And so when it comes to things like statues and people getting to this point of pulling down a statue, I'm not quite sure where I sit, in so much as I do believe in the rule of law. but also this was a heinous, ongoing, reprehensible symbol of
I think
terrible
perhaps we
acts.
can. I think perhaps we can get an idea of quite how complicated this is, and how politicians are tying themselves up in knots over it. If we look at the history of one Richard Eddy, who's a Conservative councillor on Bristol City Council, Mr. Eddy said that he was, quote, "I'm horrified and appalled by the rank lawlessness which was exposed in Bristol on Sunday, when the famous statue of Edward Colston was attacked and vandalised by a criminal mob." The word mob is being used a lot certainly in parts of the conservative-leaning media and social media, when in fact nobody was hurt. And if you look at the if you look at the video, it's more like a party than a riot. I'm not, although as you say, law breaking. Yes, there was. It is a court might find that criminal damage was committed. However, Eddy continued. Edward Colston, to me and generations of Bristolians, stands out as a hero whose wealth has continued to benefit housing, education, and healthcare for the citizens of this city. That is actually true.
Yeah. Although only if you subscribe to the same politics that he did. He was a very selective philanthropist. But anyway, go ahead.
That is true.
Yes.
Then he said, "This frenzied, using the word again, thug violence on Sunday. I've received a stream of outrage responses from constituents and others, more than I've ever received in such a short time in my 28 years of council service." Now, it's worth pointing out here that among that 28 years of council service, Mr. Eddy is known for two other things. When the plaque was suggested, which will be attached to the Colston statue to point out his links with slavery in the West Indies, he on record as saying that if people disagree with it, they'd be quite within their rights to go and remove it. The other thing he's famous for is for resigning as deputy leader of the Conservative group in, I think, 2002, because he was found to be displaying a gollywog in his office.
I see.
I say I'll leave our audience to make up their own minds about that one, but it's a complicated story. It's tied in with lots of perceived positions and received positions, and perhaps some values which maybe we wouldn't like to dig into too far in case of what we find.
Yeah. I think that is true. I think. Well, actually, keeping it to things that I can hopefully speak on with a little bit of authority. Within my own family, my mum, her mum, had tremendously difficult relationships with some of these issues. They were both from Liverpool. Liverpool was also involved in the triangle, and when it came to, for example, gollywogs, the marmalade teddy, the symbol of marmalade for a long time, they thought that they were harmless. They turn up in Noddy stories, for example, Enid Blyton, and it was very interesting how it was so detached from precisely what happened and how it happened and the reality of how it happened, that people actually have nostalgia for some of the symbols that are linked with Britain's connection to the trade. I mean, I don't want to go. I don't want to divert us down the path of dodgy teddy bears any further. But actually, there've been some very interesting and useful responses in terms of historians and archaeologists. And I think one of them that I think you certainly pointed out to me, Andy, very you gave this a thumbs up, was from David Olusoga, the presenter of House Through Time,
which we talked about in the last Watching Brief.
We did, in fact, it went live yesterday, I think. It was your media pick this month.
Indeed.
Toppling, he wrote a piece in the Guardian, headline: "The toppling of Edward Colston statue is not an attack on history; it is history." And this is where I think it's really important to highlight that. Well, three things. First of all, nothing lasts forever. That's something that archaeology teaches us. Secondly, symbols are powerful because they have a presence, but also their absence can be equally powerful. And thirdly, this is nothing new. Iconoclasm has happened forever. The Banbury Cross here in Britain, in ancient Egypt, there was a culture of trashing the faces of previous pharaohs, for example, to reinforce your godhood or your particular regime. Noses, for example, would be cut off statues. People are allowed and have been allowed, even in some of the most theocratic regimes in human history, they've been allowed to change what it is that they have on their statuary, and who and how they honour these things. I don't know. I mean, essentially, I guess it's punk has always been a part of human identity. And I think David points that out very powerfully. I don't know. But shall we, Bethany? Do you want to come in at this point again?
Yeah, something that you just mentioned about kind of changing your statuary and what represents our history. That we've touched upon the fact that Colston's name is well known in Bristol, and he's known for his philanthropy, and is essentially his name is heavily involved in the creation of modern Bristol.
Yeah.
There are two schools in Bristol. There's Colston's School and there's Colston's Girls' School. And the day after the statue was pulled down and thrown into the harbour, Colston's Girls' School took down their own smaller statue of Colston that was in their, I think it was in like a reception room of the school, and they removed it, and have also said that they're considering changing their name. And I know that there are multiple places that are looking into, whether or not they should change their names, remove certain plaques and certain statues. The whole thing with Colston's Girls' School as well is it's not simply that it takes its name from him. It was directly funded by him through a financial endowment. The school wasn't opened until about 170 years after Colston died. It says it was funded through a financial endowment from the slave trader. So already it's just interesting to see how quickly the kind of ball has gotten rolling.
Yeah. Well, and also
that's a very interesting point, Bethany, you just made there, I think, and it's worth again highlighting. There's something very special to Bristol about how Colston and his reputation and his money have actually been guarded and perpetuated through into the modern history of the city. There's an organisation called the Bristol Society of Merchant Venturers, which began in the Middle Ages as a sort of merchant guild, like the ones you get in other parts of Europe and other cities in Europe.
There's one in York, one of my favourite guilds.
Indeed, yeah, absolutely. The Bristol one is still very influential in terms of it has a big headquarters, it has a lot of money, some of which comes from Colston, and it's been the gatekeeper really of Colston's reputation. Now, one of the things I picked up from social media, there is a Bristol solicitor called Marty Burgess, who is, and this is astonishing given that we're in 2020, Marty Burgess is the first black member of the Bristol Society of Merchant Venturers. And Marty Burgess tweeted, all the opportunities to contextualise or put the statue, in a museum were squandered by those resistant to change. This is the result. And I, for one, shall raise a glass tonight to celebrate and hope for real change in the city. And I think the other thing it's really worth mentioning again for people that don't know Bristol. Bristol is a wonderful multicultural melting pot now, and there's a particular part of the city that is like Bristol's equivalent to Brixton, called St Paul's, where in fact I used to live. But Bristol, it's a very creative city. It has a very lively theatre and band scene. Lots of writers and actors and so on live there, because it's a very pleasant place to live. But it's outside, but it's still within easy striking distance of London, and so on. So it is a remarkable place. And in fact, if any place was going to do this and respond properly and creatively, I think Bristolians will do it.
Well, something that I find
whether they're going to be allowed to.
Yeah. Yeah. Something that I find astonishing, though, from that case in point about the school being funded 170 years after Colston's death, is just how long-lived the monetary legacy can be. You know, when people talk about how Britain and, frankly, of course, the US as well, was built on the back of slavery and benefited directly from it, it's happening now. There's still live, funds and money around that was seeded by this trade, and I find that actually surprising. If you know what I mean, we sort of think about oh well, that surely that money would have been spent by now, but no, it's still around, it's still used, it's still being invested. Just going back to the comments here. There's been loads of comments. Tommy Gunn, until you guys admit there's a massive anti-white agenda in all of the West, you won't be able to see reality. Okay, if you want to say that, Tommy, you can do. That's fine.
Yeah, well,
Um,
he has.
he has said it.
Made his point.
Well done, Tommy.
Made
Well
his
done.
point now.
I think it's also important to mention that Sadiq Khan, says Tabitha, has announced the statue of Robert Milligan, a Scottish slaver. I went all a bit Sean Connery there. Scottish slaver, merchant and ship owner, is being removed from the West India Quay. Okay, and actually, it was today that I think Sadiq Khan announced that there was going to be a review of statues across London and statuary.
And in fact,
it's happening in Manchester as well, I think.
Right.
Well, and in fact, nationally, there was an announcement this afternoon. Late this afternoon, just before while we were prepping this, that Labour local authorities have taken the decision across the country to actually review their street names and street furniture, looking for potential issues like Colston.
And so, can we just for a second just frame this slightly differently, because there will be people saying, oh, a little bit like with so-called cancel culture on Twitter, oh, someone said something 12 years ago and then their whole career is ruined, this kind of thing. Oh yeah, so what if Winston Churchill said some racist stuff? He was an amazing man, this kind of thing. But the thing is, no one would tolerate a statue, for example, and I'm going to go to the extreme of Hitler or Pol Pot, for example, being put up or being venerated in Britain. People simply wouldn't stand for those people, because they are intimately connected with the worst things they ever did in their lives, and in fact to humanity. This isn't a witch hunt. This isn't an attempt to to find the worst and root it, and in particular, for example, dismantle a white heritage in Britain. This is rather an assessment of who we want to be now and how we want to be now. And just as, for example, as we touched on with the ancient Egyptian example, this stuff is a constant conversation. And the irony here, and I'm sure for many people watching or who will watch this, is that many archaeologists are not wedded to some sort of fixed statuary, monolithic notion of the past. The stuff of our subject, the stuff of our study, is how that stuff is decayed and destroyed and recontextualized and graffitied. Pompeii wouldn't be interesting were it not for the graffiti, to be honest. For me at least, anyway. So this is the stuff of our study. But just to go back to the comments as well, actually, we have Joe Losh. Sorry, I've got a problem with the S's today. I found historic England's response surprising. Personally, I agree. They don't condone the unauthorized removal, but acknowledge that it was a source of pain, and do not believe it should have been that it should be reinstated. Now, I don't know.
Now, to be fair to them, that's not what they say. What they say is very cleverly nuanced, and it's worth actually, perhaps as we move into perhaps the final third of our discussion, it's worth perhaps listening to what Historic England actually said. Now, Historic England is the regulator. Historic England would normally prosecute a heritage crime, which the damage to a Grade 2 listed monument, which we saw on Sunday, is a heritage crime if it were proven. Right. So Historic England have that role. And what they said was, Edward Colston statue in Bristol has long been the focus of debate due to his involvement in the slave trade, and we have engaged in local conversations about how it could be reinterpreted to tell the full story. We recognise the statue as a symbol of injustice and a source of great pain for many people. While we do not condone the unauthorised removal of a listed structure, we recognise and understand the emotion and the hurt that the public historical commemoration can generate, and we encourage Bristol City to engage in a city-wide conversation about the future of the statue. We're here to offer guidance and support, but believe the decision is best made at a local level, and this is the key bit. We do not believe it must be reinstated.
No. Yeah. Okay.
The nuance on the word must is really important. They're saying it could be reinstated, but they don't believe it must be. Normally, and we saw the case in North London recently where a developer demolished a listed pub without planning permission. They had to rebuild it brick by brick as a facsimile.
Yeah.
That's not what we're talking about here.
No,
and that's a very nuanced response.
Well, and in that sense, the question is then, what is the future of these sorts of materials? Someone actually has literally just commented, Vort has just commented, a fair compromise could be to remove controversial figures into museums, accept that they are out of date, and that they belong in history without unauthorized destruction of monuments. And that is a fair point. And also, actually, an additional point I would mention would be my experience from having family in Liverpool and visiting that city quite often, in particular in my childhood, was the realization that the heart of the city, the oldest part of the city, is littered with symbols of slavery. You know, the mayor's house is got little black boys basically carrying things, and all this sort of stuff. There's a whole series of banks to do with insuring shipping cargo on that street as well, and I remember there being strong conversations about what should happen with this material, this art. And actually, certainly the last I knew, at least, on one of the banks that I always stop at whenever I see it, I always stop and look at this image on the wall as you go into the bank. You've got this objectively beautiful sculpture, or bas relief rather, of an African face holding up the bounties of the trade and essentially demonstrating why Liverpool became the city that it is. So artistically, it is elegant, shall we say, and actually, it is the black voices in Liverpool who have been calling for that to stay. And instead of taking it down, what they've done last I saw was they covered it in perspex, so it was preserved. It's a confrontation, and it is a reminder to people, if they care to stop and look, as to where Liverpool's wealth came from. And actually, as we just heard in the Bristol example, how that wealth can even be live today in terms of how it's been invested and reinvested over time. And so this argument of putting statues into museums, I know this is something which has also been discussed about Confederate statuary, especially more stuff from the early 20th century. And we've talked about it previously on this channel. Actually, I had a conversation with Jeanette a little while ago about that. That's one way of doing it. But the other way is to very deliberately keep it and make sure people see it, and perhaps then have conversations about it. In this case, they didn't feel the need to put information below, but it is there to be seen and to be pointed at, for example, when people do a tour of the city. Should we quickly just hand over to Bethany and then come back to you, Andy?
Well, actually, can I ask Bethany a specific question, actually? Because from what Mark, what you were just saying, and it just occurred to me, another part of the context this is happening in, and we talked about Roads Must Fall at Oriel College earlier. One of the contexts for this is the idea of decolonization in academia, which is again relatively new. But I think that's a part of the academic context for the responses to this. And I'd be interested in hearing what Bethany had to say about that thought.
I'm not really sure, Andy. It's just.
It's just that you're going through the system at the moment, so you're perhaps more in touch with current courses. Look like than maybe Mark or I are. So yeah. And you mentioned the module. You mentioned the module earlier as well that you'd undertaken.
Yeah, I mean that module, like I say, it was the module itself was about early modern history in Britain specifically, and it had one lecture and I think one seminar specifically related to this topic. And again, focusing on slave trade in harbour towns in Britain. So we looked at Bristol and Liverpool and a bit at London. But there was never really, especially in that module, there was nothing else touched upon. And I'm not saying that that's at fault. It was covering like a big, broad spectrum of history. In terms of optional modules on this topic at universities, it's very rarely there seems to be one. There's very rarely a focus, like a deep focus on this. And I know it's been touched upon as well recently, the big debate of bringing things like this into the national curriculum, not just at universities, but within schools. It is something that I think needs to be, it does need to be taught and looked upon more. It's a very important part of Britain's history and Britain's modern history. But it's a tough one, I think, for me to answer, even though as a student, I find it quite hard.
Well, also, can I just say something else as well with regards to this idea of Britain's history? I just want to just very briefly just bring in a flavour of, for example, the Welsh perspective, in so much as I'm always reluctant to directly map, obviously, Welsh history onto the slave trade, because it doesn't map at all. But Britain has form for reducing uncomfortable voices, and more to the point, the English, especially the English in power, have form for reducing uncomfortable voices, and it's essentially a lived experience in Wales to be ignored, and the reason why I say this is that this is so ingrained in British society that actually it's become a way of life. You know, it's all well and good to have, for example, a proud Scottish identity, but that identity is, broadly speaking, built on an opposition to that act of being ignored, that act of being disenfranchised, and in that sense, these conversations have their roots so deep in how we think about ourselves, how we talk to each other, how we relate to the rest of the world, that even, for example, the English word for the Welsh is rooted in welha. It means outsider, different, not one of us.
The outsiders, the foreigners.
Precisely, the foreigners. And so the only reason why I'm mentioning that is just to say that actually there's, and it's to say that it goes deep and there's an awful lot to talk about, an awful lot that could be talked about. But I suppose, I guess, in the last 10 minutes or so of this stream, maybe it's worthwhile just asking the question, how and where does that start? Because the thing is, I am now, as much as as I understand, for example, in the Welsh case, the Welsh perspective, I'm also actually part of the establishment. I've been to a very good English university. I hang around and have benefited from structures that are tied to authority and political power in Britain. But just as simple as, for example, things like going to the CBA to do an interview with Mike Hayworth. This stuff is everywhere. So how on earth do we start to pull it apart in a way that isn't just destructive, if you know what I mean? That's actually constructive.
I think we have to recognise where the current narratives came from, for a start, and acknowledge their frailties. Can I just read you a very short extract from a book that I was reminded of when this discussion started, and which I've had on my bookshelf for a number of years without actually sitting down to read properly. This is from a history book, and I'll read you a short passage and see what you think. It says, another great thing that happened during the reign of William IV was the freeing of slaves. For many years, people have been in the habit of stealing black people from their homes in Africa and selling them as slaves in the colonies. People had grown used to it, so used to it that they did not see how wicked and cruel this was. These poor black people were taken to market and sold like cattle. They were branded like cattle and beaten like cattle. They had to work very hard and were paid no wages and were often very cruelly treated. All masters, of course, were not cruel. Some of them were even kind to their poor slaves, but they still lived unhappy lives. They had no rights whatsoever, and the children might be taken from them and sold. Even sometimes husbands and wives were sold to different masters and never saw each other again. A master might treat his slaves as badly as he chose, and no one could punish him. In the old rough, wild days, no one cared about the sufferings of the poor black people. They were viewed as only made for work and suffering, and nothing was thought about it. But as time went on, people became less rough and more kind-hearted, and good men began to try to make people see the wickedness of slavery. For some years, a man called Wilberforce, who'd been doing his best, and now he was joined by others, among whom was Macaulay. Mr. Macaulay himself had been the manager of a sugar plantation in the West Indies where slaves worked, but he gave up his post because he could not bear to see the misery and unhappiness of the slaves, and came home to try and do something for them. It was not a very easy thing to do, because all the work on the sugar and the coffee plantations in the West Indies was done by slaves. The planters said they would be ruined if the slaves were made free. Besides, they paid a great deal of money for the slaves, and it seemed unfair that they should be made to lose it all. But at last, all difficulties were smoothed away. The British Parliament said they would give 20 millions of money to the planters to make up for what they would lose in freeing of their slaves, and in the year 1834, most of them were set free. Now, that book is Our Island Story, and it was published in 1905, but the edition I'm looking at was republished in 2005, and it was published by with a grant from a right of centre think tank called Civitas, and they were going to sponsor copies to go into each school library in the country.
And essentially, that attempts to draw a neat line under it, doesn't it?
It mentions no. Yes.
But in so much as, so for example, I have seen in recent days people responding to shared articles and so on and so forth, along the lines of, well, why doesn't anyone talk about the fact that Britain ended this? Britain ended slavery. No one ever talks about that. And the thing is, we do talk about it. We even have coinage that celebrates it. It's everywhere. but the context.
And we didn't anyway, because lots of other people didn't. The Haitians did it first.
Well, but precisely. But the thing is, Britain was pushed in that sense. It was pushed by, for example, the Haitian Revolution, by the fact that actually slavery was becoming less and less economical, the fact that the French had a much more tenuous relationship with their North American holdings than ever before. It wasn't benign, and I think this is why I mentioned, for example, the Welsh perspective, is that the subjugation of language, for example, none of this is benign. None of this was, freedoms like voting wasn't given to people. It came through conversation, through protest, through awareness, through consciousness of common humanity and common human struggle. Rosemary Morgan commented here saying, I do historic interpretation at a local living history museum, and we have the captives room where captured and enslaved native people would be put to work. We don't sugarcoat it. She suggests that in our case, for example, moving forward, I hate that phrase, but I just said it. She suggests start talking about it. Don't ignore it. Don't sugarcoat it. Research and learn about it. And we've also had someone here asking if they can join the discussion panel. To be honest, we're open to other people and other voices joining in. If we do another one of these in the near future, we will put out a call ahead of time, and allow people, if they want to get involved. Certainly. So yeah, if you feel as though you want to get involved, but I won't condone people turning up to talk about cultural Marxism and anti-white movements, because they don't exist, I'm afraid. However, just coming back then, now we have roughly 7 minutes left, 6 and 15 seconds. Where can and should this go? Because for me, and I suppose I'll just lay out my stall for this section. For me, it comes from educating people not just about the evils of slavery, but also about the simple fact that people have always acted upon public symbols to change publicly how they view their past and who they want to be now. I think in that sense, David's article in The Guardian puts that beautifully. If people didn't topple the statue, the history of that happening wouldn't be obvious. You know, the same goes for so many statues. In, for example, in Rome, great acts of vandalism have archaeological merit. I'll hand over to you. So, shall we start with you, Bethany, and then go to Andy, or whoever wants to go first?
I got Bethany. You go first.
Just for, I guess, where we go from here, and bringing it back full circle to our discussion of Colston and where this all started, was Banksy released a statement, I think about 7 hours ago, on his Instagram.
Sorry, the signal just went a bit.
What should we do?
Sorry, the signal went a bit dodgy. That was Banksy the artist, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah,
it was early this afternoon, and he put out a statement saying, "What should we do with the empty plinth in the middle of Bristol? Here's an idea that caters for both who miss the Colston statue and those who don't. We drag him out the water, put him back on the plinth, tie the cable around his neck, and commission some life-size bronze statues of protesters in the act of pulling him down. Everyone happy and a famous day commemorated." And then he put in a little charcoal sketch of how he wanted this proposed statue to look, which I thought was quite nice.
Interesting.
Yeah, I quite like the idea of whatever happens with this statue, whether they put it back on the plinth if that's what they want to do, or it goes to a museum, that it's not cleaned and repaired. The damage is left to it, because we keep talking about it's a next chapter of the statue's history. And I think that's quite an important thing to remember. People say, the removal of the statue completely is trying to erase history, but similarly, if we then put the statue back where it was, clean it up, and try and forget about what happened, that is also erasing history. And I think Banksy's idea kind of, as he says, caters to both. Might still be seen controversial, but it is an attempt to cater to both parties.
Yeah, the metal itself returns to the plinth. Yeah. Interesting. Andy, what do you think?
I think two things really in conclusion. One is that although we're far too close to it still to be able to tell absolutely, but this does feel like a genuine historical moment. I can't think of any other equivalent incident in my lifetime that's had quite so much resonance quite so quickly. It's something that maybe was called for, but that actually not just the community of Bristol with that particular statue, but hopefully debates like this are going to be had up and down the country with communities discussing how they want their public spaces to be used to commemorate historical events and people. And I noticed that one of the other ideas for the Bristol plinth is to place the statue of a Bristol civil rights worker who led the opposition to the Bristol bus boycott in the early the Bristol bus colour bar in the early 1960s, where Bristol Corporation didn't employ black bus drivers. So but that's making a different kind of statement for now. I think the other thing as well is taking the long view. It's really important that we, as historians and archaeologists, interpreters, we give voice to the voiceless, people who can't speak anymore, like those men, women and children who were taken on the Middle Passage, and some of whom ended up in the middle of the Atlantic because it wasn't economic to keep them alive and get them to the far side. And so we have a responsibility to make sure that history isn't sugar-coated and is treated absolutely fairly, but fair and square. But also that I think we also have to be aware that history does come in waves. I'm reminded of the destruction of all the statues of communist leaders that happened after 1990 in the former Soviet Union, particularly the Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was the founder of what became the KGB, whose statue, one of the symbols of the end of Soviet Russia was the destruction of Dzerzhinsky's statue in what's now the Lubyanka Square, formerly Dzerzhinsky Square. But 15 years later, his statues are being put up again in Russia under Putin. So what happened. What we have to remember in the end is what happened on Sunday. It's really important for now, and in many ways, it's quite exciting. It's also a big responsibility for any of us trying to deal with it, and we're only making decisions for now. 15, 20, 30 years time, things might look very different.
Yeah. No, that's true. I suppose a couple of things just to add to that thought. First of all, actually, in former Soviet parts, for example, in and around Moscow, in I think Latvia as well, they have cemeteries. They have statue cemeteries where former Soviet art is still on display, but it's on display in the context of essentially a graveyard for statuary. Um, one more thing as well that came out of conversations with friends. I have an Italian friend, historian, who in the heat of the moment said to me, "Well, should we now go and tear down the Colosseum because of all the Christians who died there?" He is a Catholic himself, and my response was no, because the Colosseum has been reconciled with Catholic people over the course of 2,000 years, to the point that now Catholic and post-Catholic Italian Romans sell tickets to go in. We're not the problem. The problem with the Colston statue is it has not been and was not being reconciled with its history. No. The Colosseum has been reconciled to the point that certainly when I visited, going on 15 years ago now, there's a great big black cross inside the building. It's been, as it were. The water has been calmed. The oil has been applied to those rough waters, and so no, not everything requires destruction, but it does require a sense of reconciliation, and this is actually something. Well, this is actually something which is pointed out in a link that I'll put below, where someone suggests that actually destroying statues is not a silver bullet. In the South African context, it was reconciliation and truth-telling. It was open conversation, in fact. I just want to briefly address one of the comments that's turning up on the chat. Hello, Green Life. I am the anchor here. I'm the host, Mr. Soup. That's me, the guy with the beard and the microphone on his head. So, Andy, just go ahead.
It was just a very quick point, really, and it's to go back to that very provocative comment that I quoted earlier from Nigel Farage. Mm-hmm. Many people who oppose this have drawn parallels with what was done by the Taliban in Afghanistan to the Buddhas of Bamiyan when they were blown up, and also by so-called Islamic State in Syria with the buildings of Palmyra that were also blown up, and also Assyrian relics from the Assyrian Empire that were destroyed, friezes and figures and so on. And I think that is actually a really false and really dangerous analogy, because those destructive acts were designed to deliberately distort or even suppress the historical narrative, i.e. that there were other religions and other civilizations in those places before those particular regimes came to power. That's the opposite to what's going on here, because first of all, I think that, as I put it on Sunday, normally I'd be horrified by the destruction of a Grade 2 monument. Mm-hmm. But what we saw here was a community, I think, choosing to relocate part of its history to the bottom of a harbour for actually what to many Bristolians would be very good reasons and not before time. Yeah. And it's not about suppressing a narrative, it's actually about saying our narrative would be richer if you included the experience of these black people who were stolen from their homes 300 years ago, 200 years ago. And we are the descendants of either physically or certainly culturally and emotionally.
Okay. Well, we have, as we're bound to, we have gone over time this evening. But thank you both for turning up this evening. Is there anything finally that you'd like to add, Bethany?
I mean, I could keep going, but like you say, we are running out of time. Something that you said as well we've all been seeing about friends saying, oh, does this mean that we should destroy this monument or this statue? And we mentioned David Olusoga talking on Twitter as well. Somebody, and again, it's another controversial thing, someone said, that Oliver Cromwell and Queen Victoria weren't exactly nice to the Irish, so does that mean we should remove their statues too? And he said, well, they were removed in Ireland.
Yeah. Yes.
And no one's saying that we should now go around and take down every statue ever and remove every single plaque and every single monument, but where that individual, it should be moved where there is a relevant context, not just taking things down willy-nilly because we don't because we disagree with them. Sorry.
Mm.
So obviously the Colston context is Bristol. It's not saying that we should remove every single statue, and that's also why Sadiq Khan has said that there's going to be a review of all statues and plaques and street names in London, and I think the same thing is happening in Manchester.
Mm.
So nobody here is condoning destruction, and no one here is saying that we should remove all history and start fresh.
No,
but
absolutely
context needs to be considered, and this is a case where, like you say, Andy, you'd normally be disgusted, at the destruction of a Grade 2 monument. And I would as well. But in this case, I don't see anything wrong with it. No. And I think we just need to remember context when discussing these things.
Yeah, and as in, for example, the Liverpool example that we mentioned earlier in this stream, it's possible to keep things in place and have them be useful in these conversations. Certainly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for turning up. It's been fun seeing your comments, and it's been fun having a chat with you, Andy and Bethany. If people come to this stream later on, or indeed, right now, if you want to see more like this in the future, please do let us know. I would be more than happy to deliver that. I suppose what we would say as well is that Andy and I are almost certainly likely to revisit this when, as it were, the aftermath is clearer in June's Watching Brief. So we'll be talking about this with a bit more of a sort of a retrospective glasses on in that context. So what were you going to say, Andy?
No.
Okay. Sorry.
I wasn't.
Sorry. So ultimately, yes.
All I was doing was just having a quick glance at my live news feed that's been playing underneath us, just to see whether Rose is still there on the front of Oriel College, and he appears to still be. And in fact, Robert Milligan is still in front of the Museum of Dockland, because the lorry that they brought to take him away was actually too heavy for the weight rating for the wharf, and so they're going to have to get a lighter lorry.
Okay, fair enough. the logistics of iconoclasm, and
Exactly.
Once again, thank you guys for turning up, and thank you everyone else for turning up for this as well. Have a good evening, everyone, and until next time, do take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.